This is one of a series of special documentaries created for United States Fidelity and Guarantee Companies and sponsored by them on television stations all across the nation. It's called American Lifestyle, and it takes an unusual look into the lives of certain people who have helped make this nation what it is today. Not just their accomplishments, but their characters and the way they lived. I've always been interested in history, and I find history presented this way quite fascinating. I think you will too, because this looks at people's deeds, but it looks also into their philosophies, the motivating influences on them, and motivating influences from them. In presenting this series, USF&G is doing something meaningful regarding our nation's past and also regarding its future. I think you're going to enjoy the series. I'm particularly glad to be hosting it. So you sit back and enjoy American Lifestyle.
If death had a first name, our man would know it. He was that well acquainted. There are at least a dozen recorded times in his life when he should have been dead, and more than once when he lived to read his own obituary in the world's press. In 1893, when he was 3, he was hit by a horse-drawn streetcar. In 1942, when he was 52, he survived a crash landing in the ocean and 24 days in a rubber raft on the boundless saltwater desert of the South Pacific. In between, there were various car and plane crashes, enemy machine gun fire, and other assorted rude reminders of the inevitable rendezvous. He had more close shaves than a farm-town barber, and his body told his autobiography in its scars. He was a marvel of a man for living and for machines, matched to a marvelous American age. Not surprisingly, they called him Edward the Indestructible, this man named Edward V. Rickenbacker.
American Lifestyle. Pilot, patriot, and 20th century pioneer, Eddie Rickenbacker's Machine Age America. Starring as your host, Mr. Hugh Down. Is brought to you by the USF&G Company and 6,500 independent insurance agencies representing USF&G.
Nobody called him Edward V. Rickenbacker, except perhaps the citation on his Congressional Medal of Honor, which he won for extraordinary valor as America's foremost combat pilot in World War I. We're in the Hall of Air Transportation at the Smithsonian Air and Space Museum in Washington, D.C. Rickenbacker's life paralleled the development of most of the machines in this room and the muscular explosion of America's incredible machine age. His own personal energy and certitude that life and men could be made better with American ideals and machinery to lead the way made Rickenbacker the perfect man for the mechanical age. It all began far from center stage in Columbus, Ohio, where Rickenbacker was born the 8th of October, 1890. The third of 8 children. 7 lived to maturity. Born to William Rickenbacker and Elizabeth Basler. Both penniless, William and Elizabeth had emigrated to America from Switzerland, had met, fallen in love, and married in Columbus. In 1893, the couple moved further into the American dream when they moved into their own house, this one, on the east side of town on Livingston Avenue, purchased with a small down payment, in cash, and a large investment in hope and hard work. The house was only 2 rooms downstairs and 2 half rooms upstairs in those early days. And Rickenbacker's father built the house himself. Rickenbacker's father was German-Swiss, dark, hard-working, strong, stern and somber, and he had a mustache. Elizabeth, the mother, was sensitive and encouraged Eddie's painting talent, which later served him well in his mechanical drafting. She was deeply religious, pretty, and a redhead. She remained close to her son throughout her 82 years. At 9, young Eddie wept uncontrollably because he was afraid to die. When the father found him in a small shed back of the house, and Eddie explained why he was sobbing, the elder Rickenbacker took a switch to the boy's bottom and forbade him ever to worry about such matters again. Eddie claims he never did again, although his mother must have taken up the job. because Eddie was always trying to get himself as close to killed as possible. Once, sleepwalking, he fell 25 feet off a balcony. He also fell into a well, out of several trees, off a train that then nearly backed over him. He got his head punctured by a hoe. And finally, he tried going off a barn roof with a bicycle and a tractor umbrella, which promptly turned inside out. This was the first of several air-related crashes. A further tenet of the American dream was formal education for one's children. And Rickenbacker's father shared the dream. But in the summer of 1904, Rickenbacker's father was operating a pile driver in the building of a new bridge when he was struck by a swinging timber that fractured his skull, and after a few days in coma, killed him. Eddie was 13. He used to come down near the railroad track to find coal for the family stove in their lean years. After the father's funeral, the mother gathered the children together and made them promise that those among them who would be successful would see that none of the others should ever be in want or need. Young Eddie, seating himself in his father's chair, further promised, "Mama, I'll never make you cry again." He could not keep that second promise, but he was unswervingly faithful to the first. This is the pit area next to the main straightaway of the Indianapolis 500-mile Motor Speedway, where each Memorial Day weekend, 33 men and machines compete in the greatest automotive spectacle on Earth, witnessed annually by over 300,000 spectators. It's a modern and far cry from the old Brickyard 2.5-mile oval that saw the first 500 in 1911. Here, in memory of the early track, is preserved a small patch of the original brick. In 1904, the track did not exist at all, of course, and the young boy barely dreamed of such spectacle. Rather, Eddie was quitting school and going to work. He lied about his age and quickly found a succession of jobs. First, in a glass factory, then a foundry, a brewery, a shoe factory, a railroad machine shop, and a monument works, where he himself carved the letters in a stone for his father's grave. Then he heard about the Freyer Miller Automobile Company. He volunteered to work for nothing and so thoroughly cleaned and swept the place that Lee Freyer finally took him on. Oh yes, he was then all of 16. Lee Freyer went to work building automobiles with the Columbus Buggy Company and took Rickenbacker with him. In short time, the boy was sent on the road to teach dealers how to repair and maintain these mercurial early machines. As he himself said, "Engines have always talked to me." In Texas, Rickenbacker demonstrated quickly his lifelong genius for public relations. Reading that Democratic hopeful William Jennings Bryan was due in town for a speech, Rickenbacker contacted him and offered his car and his services as a chauffeur to take the famous man around. The pictures next day appeared in the press all over. Rickenbacker was a born salesman, and the best way to sell cars in the early days of the automotive business was to be a race driver. His reckless nature had finally found its focus. He became a celebrity throughout the Mid and Southwest, once winning 9 races in 2 days. He beat the famous Barney Oldfield and survived several dangerous crashes. He was promoted to branch manager and was earning $150 a month, enough to pay off his father's debts and send his brothers and sisters to school. In 1911, he came to Indianapolis. In the Auto Racing Museum inside the great track usually stands this famous Duesenberg that Rickenbacker drove not only here at Indy, but around the nation, and in which he won scores of races. While Rickenbacker became a national celebrity through auto racing, and in 1916 won $60,000, he never could, in 6 attempts, win the big one here. His best finish was in the first race in 1911, when he drove relief for Lee Freyer and finished 10th behind the winner, Ray Haroun, who revolutionized racing that year by riding without a mechanic and by using a newfangled device called a rear-view mirror. There was to be a further chapter in Eddie Rickenbacker's life involving the Indianapolis 500, but not before he and the world had been engulfed by the horrifying events of World War I. By 1916, the European powers had already been fighting for 2 years, when Rickenbacker was invited to England to test the new British-made Sunbeam auto, the plan being that Rickenbacker would race it in America. The Sunbeam test track doubled as a Royal Air Force base, and Rickenbacker fell in love with flying. He wanted to join the British in the air war against Germany, but his request was rejected. In February 1917, Germany declared that American vessels would no longer be free from U-boat attacks, and Americans abroad had only a 5-day grace period in which to go home. The United States immediately broke off diplomatic relations with the Germans, and Rickenbacker came home. Convinced of the rightness of the Allied cause, the popular Rickenbacker made several speeches around the country urging our speedy entry into the war. His slogan was the 3 M's: men, money, munitions. Even before America's official entry into the war, Rickenbacker joined the Army as a sergeant driver and sailed with a secret crossing to England that included General John Pershing and Airman General Billy Mitchell. Eddie was 27. After 17 days of flight training and 10 days of gunnery practice, Rickenbacker was commissioned a first lieutenant and declared a combat pilot. He was flying a Newport like this one. He was assigned to the 94th Aero Pursuit Squadron, which became the famous Hat in the Ring Squadron. That was in March of 1918. Rickenbacker shot down his first German plane on April 29th. By the end of May, he was a certified ace with 5 kills to his credit. The French awarded him the Croix de Guerre. During the entire month of June, Rickenbacker was grounded with high fever and chills, and he did not return to the 94th Squadron until July 5th. When he did come back, he flew one of the new Spads assigned to the unit. The Spad was the most advanced fighter plane of its time, capable of climbing to 22,000 feet and with a top speed of 130 miles an hour. Still, Rickenbacker didn't get too much chance to test the new machine because he developed mastoiditis and was grounded again the rest of July and all of August. But in September, Eddie was well again and back with his unit, where in 2 days he enjoyed 2 more kills, these against the feared German Fokker airplane of the Flying Circus Squadron. That was commanded by Manfred von Richthofen, the famous Red Baron. Richthofen shot down a total of 80 Allied planes before finally being downed himself. In late September, Rickenbacker was promoted to captain and was made commanding officer of the 94th. During the month of October 1918, Captain Eddie Rickenbacker shot down the incredible total of 14 German planes, which gave him an overall total for the war of 26 planes. The 94th was the most successful American air unit of the war. Rickenbacker, the undisputed American ace of aces. He came home a hero of heroes. When he did reach home in January of 1919, Rickenbacker was deluged with offers of every kind of commercial gimmick, as well as vaudeville tours and movie star contracts. Rickenbacker spurned them all. He knew he no longer wanted to race cars, but he decided he did want to build one that would include all his automotive ideas and would bear his name, and one that would be worthy of his name. In fact, that became the company's slogan, a car worthy of its name. The Rickenbacker car did indeed become a reality. With 3 experienced automotive partners, Rickenbacker designed a car in the medium price range, between the low-priced Ford and the high-priced Packard and Cadillac. The Rickenbacker was an early hit, and 50,000 cars were sold in the first 2 years. Finally, Rickenbacker felt financially secure enough to think about marriage, and he fell in love, at second sight, one might say, with a divorcee named Adelaide Frost Durant, whom he had known in California before the war. The couple was married on September 16, 1922. Adelaide and Eddie had 2 sons, David Edward, born in 1925, and William Frost, born in 1928. Adelaide and Rickenbacker stayed married until Eddie's death 51 years later. Among other innovations, Rickenbacker added 4-wheel brakes to his car, which prompted other manufacturers to gang up against him. This, plus a severe economic recession in 1925, mortally wounded the Rickenbacker Motor Company, which went bankrupt in 1927. Rickenbacker was 35 years old, $250,000 in personal debt, and out of a job. We're back in Indianapolis. A Detroit banker friend called him and said, "Nevertheless, I believe in you. Find something you want to do, and I'll help." In that same year, 1927, the 4 founders of the Indianapolis racetrack were ready to sell it. The price, $700,000. Rickenbacker remembered his friend in Detroit and hurried to him. An hour before the option deadline, Rickenbacker had the money. He resurfaced the track with asphalt, reinforced the walls, and added an 18-hole golf course. He successfully maintained the great racing classic until World War II curtailed the event after 1941. In 1945, Rickenbacker sold the track to an Indiana businessman named Anton Tony Holman, who brought it to new and continued success as its owner. Throughout these years, Rickenbacker kept alive his zeal for flying. Also in the 20s, Rickenbacker went to work for General Motors in the Cadillac LaSalle division and was heading for the presidency when GM bought heavily into the airline industry with Rickenbacker's enthusiastic counsel and encouragement. But Rickenbacker himself cared little about money and a lot about flying. He soon emerged as a tireless and talented chief executive of what, by 1935, became known as Eastern Airlines. With a $3.5 million backing from Wall Street supporters, Rickenbacker bought Eastern from General Motors, his former employers, and set about to make it the most efficient and profitable airline in America. In fact, until after World War II, it was the only U.S. airline that survived without government subsidy and the only one to operate in the black. Rickenbacker was beloved by many of his employees, nearly all of whom he knew by first name. And he was responsible for an astonishing number of innovations, both mechanical and human. During his trips to Germany in the 30s, Rickenbacker had been shown by Hermann Goering personally the buildup of the German Luftwaffe. Rickenbacker in vain tried to warn England and his own countrymen that war and punishing air war was inevitable. Nobody who counted listened. In December, the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, and as Rickenbacker had foreseen, America was tragically unprepared. But what now could Rickenbacker do for his stricken country? He was 51 years old, and barely better than broken himself. As we'll see, he performed unbelievable service to the wartime nation. Once again, in the sternest test of all, proved that he deserved the title Edward the Indestructible. I'll tell you about it soon, after this message. In addition to leasing half of Eastern's equipment and the services of its manpower throughout the war, Rickenbacker traveled around the world on dangerous and often secret missions on behalf of Secretary of War Henry Stimson and Air Chief General Hap Arnold. He was also instrumental in the pre-war development of the workhorse DC-3 and created important improvements for the B-17 and B-24 bombers, as well as for the P-38 and P-40 fighter planes. His salary was $1 a year. His first assignment was in March 1942, when he toured all the American training air bases and developed a detailed program for teaching new pilots and for increasing efficient production and supply. Next came a similar journey to the European theater. Then, in October of 1942, he set out on a tour of our Pacific installations. Rickenbacker, with an aide and a crew of 6, left Hickam Field, Hawaii, in a B-17 for the first hop to Canton Island, on a journey that was supposed to end at General MacArthur's headquarters in Port Moresby, New Guinea. But Flight Captain William Cherry and the big plane never did find Canton. Finally, with its fuel exhausted, Cherry was forced to crash land in the ocean. It was a miracle that all 8 men survived the impact of the ditching. They scrambled out and gathered in 3 small rubber life rafts roped together. In their haste, they had forgotten to bring the food and water rations. They started their aimless and agonizing voyage with just 4 oranges. If Rickenbacker was almost the oldest, he was also the toughest and the most inventive. He immediately became the leader. He had left his clothes on, and also his faithful old fedora, the one he later said his wife had always threatened to throw out. 2 of the other men had stripped and nearly died of exposure to the blazing sun during the day, and the rattling chill at night. Rickenbacker made the group sing, tell their life stories in intimate detail, read from the Bible, and pray. Sharks were a constant threat. So was salt water, a liquid temptress to the parched men. The oranges lasted 6 days. On the 8th day, after Rickenbacker had finished reading from the New Testament pocketbook that one of the men had, a minor but major miracle occurred. A seagull landed on Rickenbacker's hat.
Our prayers were answered. And if we hadn't had, or I hadn't had 7 witnesses, I wouldn't dare tell the story where a seagull landed on my head and gave us food to sustain us for 2 days.
On the 9th day, it rained. Its drops caught in a bucket, briefly soothing parched throats. On the 10th, a young sergeant who at night had been secretly drinking salt water convulsed in Rickenbacker's arms and died. Rickenbacker resolved anew to live, and he alternately mothered and railed at the remaining 6 men to do the same. Later, several men confessed that their strongest motive to survive was to see Rickenbacker dead. On the 19th day, they heard a plane, which passed them by. On the 20th, there were 2 more. It was a new agony, but also a new hope. On the 23rd day, against Rickenbacker's advice, the men decided to separate their rafts and go off in different directions. 2 men each in 2 rafts soon disappeared. Rickenbacker was left in the 3rd raft with 2 unconscious companions. Then, on November 13th, a Friday, the 24th day, the most joyous music Rickenbacker had ever heard came to his ears. Plane engines, Navy planes, which did not spot him on the first pass, but which hours later, on a second flyby, did. The planes circled until a Navy PT boat arrived about sunset. The other 4 men had been spotted and picked up earlier. Rickenbacker was found 40 miles off the Ellis Islands, 500 miles southwest of Canton, their original destination. Rickenbacker, who normally weighed 180 pounds, checked into the Samoa Navy Hospital, read his obituary. There was a cartoon by C.D. Batchelder in the New York Daily News with a black wreath floating in the waves, saying, "So long, Eddie." The artist wrote in, "Beg pardon, Eddie," months later when he gave Rickenbacker the original cartoon. Oh yes, Rickenbacker completed his special mission to MacArthur before returning to America and addressing the nation, and finally reuniting with his beloved family. Rickenbacker continued to serve the nation during the war, and in the post-war era, led Eastern Airlines to new successes and into the jet age. But in 1973, age 83, Edward the Indestructible surrendered to the inevitable. He had a massive stroke while in Zurich, Switzerland, land of his parents' birth. The circle was complete, and the gray fedora was out of the ring. Captain Eddie's ashes were brought home to Columbus for a final service at this chapel in Greenlawn Cemetery. Overhead, the planes came in a missing leader formation, the aerial equivalent of the riderless horse. And this was his final resting place. As American technology moved inexorably toward automation, computers, push buttons, the knight-errant mechanics and heroes such as Rickenbacker were being replaced by anonymous disciples of science and engineering. But at the dawn and through mid-morning of the 20th century, machinery was still man-sized, and the romantic value systems of the 19th century still prevailed. It was a time, perhaps the last, when men could match and master their machines and their mortality, and still believe in themselves and in God. Once he said, "He who does most lives most. He who lives most gives most." It was a fitting epitaph. And in the planes and personnel of Eastern Airlines are his living memorials. Rickenbacker was acquainted with death on a first-name basis, but in the end prevailed as an American immortal. Godspeed and happy landing.
American lifestyle. Pilot, patriot, and 20th century pioneer, Eddie Rickenbacker's Machine Age America. Starring as your host, Mr. Hugh Downs. Has been brought to you by the USF&G Company and 6,500 independent insurance agencies representing USF&G. Century pioneer, Eddie Rickenbacker's Machine Age America. Starring as your host, Mr. Hugh Downs. Is brought to you by the USF&G Company and 6,500 independent insurance agencies representing USF&G.
Nobody called him Edward B. Rickenbacker, except perhaps the citation on his Congressional Medal of Honor, which he won for extraordinary valor as America's foremost combat pilot in World War I. We're in the Hall of Air Transportation at the Smithsonian Air and Space Museum in Washington, D.C. Rickenbacker's life paralleled the development of most of the machines in this room and the muscular explosion of America's incredible machine age. His own personal energy and certitude that life and men could be made better with American ideals and machinery to lead the way made Rickenbacker the perfect man for the mechanical age. It all began far from center stage in Columbus, Ohio, where Rickenbacker was born the 8th of October, 1890. The third of 8 children. 7 lived to maturity. Born to William Rickenbacker and Elizabeth Basler. Both penniless, William and Elizabeth had emigrated to America.
In presenting this series, USF&G is doing something meaningful regarding our nation's past and also regarding its future. I think you're going to enjoy the series. I'm particularly glad to be hosting it. So you sit back and enjoy American lifestyle.
If death had a first name, our man would know it. He was that well acquainted. There are at least a dozen recorded times in his life when he should have been dead, and more than once when he lived to read his own obituary in the world's press. In 1893, when he was 3, he was hit by a horse-drawn streetcar. In 1942, when he was 52, he survived a crash landing in the ocean, and
This is one of a series of special documentaries created for United States Fidelity and Guarantee Companies. It's sponsored by them on television stations all across the nation. It's called American Lifestyle, and it takes an unusual look into the lives of certain people who have helped make this nation what it is today. Not just their accomplishments, but their characters and the way they lived. I've always been interested in history, and I find history presented this way quite fascinating. I think you will too, because this looks at people's deeds, but it looks also into their philosophies, the motivating influences on them, and motivating influences from them.
4 days in a rubber raft on the boundless saltwater desert of the South Pacific. In between, there were various car and plane crashes, enemy machine gun fire, and other assorted rude reminders of the inevitable rendezvous. He had more close shaves than a farm town barber, and his body told his autobiography in its scars. He was a marvel of a man for living and for machines, matched to a marvelous American age. Not surprisingly, they called him Edward the Indestructible, this man named Edward B. Rickenbacker.
American lifestyle. Pilot, patriot, and 20th